The term indie was first used to differentiate between mainstream pop music and independent artists. Indie music charts first came about in the UK in the early 1980s. The 80s, it is said, saw the rise of the indie kid. At this time, bands such as the Smiths, R.E.M. and the Stone Roses were emerging and quickly becoming popular with the UK public. The Smiths were one of the first bands to be categorised as indie, as they were solely focused on guitar, bass, drum and vocal songs, which was unlike other artists at that time. Before this time, indie was classed as very underground, and artists typically play at very small venues, such as the Astoria, Charing Cross Road, and the Roundhouse, Chalk Farm Road, or in their garages. This set the idea of indie music being very makeshift and a do-it-yourself style of music. Tony Wills, often called Mr. Manchester by the press, was the founder of Factory Records, who were the reason for the success of Joy Division, who later became New Order after the death of Ian Curtis. Many people say that this was the label responsible for the birth of the Manchester scene in the 1980s. Manchester was a cultural scene that developed in Manchester in which artists merged alternative rock with acid house culture. Manchester was arguably the defining youth culture of the late 1980s and early 1990s in Britain. Along with Joy Division, other iconic artists that contributed to the Manchester phase included the Stone Roses, Happy Mondays and the Charlatans. Manchester is still very much relevant now, even though several artists that contributed to the culture are no longer together. Manchester is still known across the country and worldwide as the home of what some will say are the most successful indie bands of all time. As a result of Manchester culture, the city still has many links with drugs, in particular ecstasy, which was readily available at the height of Manchester culture. Dave Haslam, a writer, broadcaster and DJ from Manchester, argued that the use and availability of ecstasy changed clubs forever. Manchester is a massive factor of indie culture, as it created an image that people instantly think of when they hear the term indie. As indie music grew in popularity, more features in society became labelled as indie. Indie was no longer just a music genre, but an image that people aspired to. This was to the point where often just by looking at someone's haircut or the clothes they wore, you could tell what sort of music they listened to. The image that people such as the Gallaghers created in the 1990s is still very much relevant today, with many people taking inspiration from the way they dressed. It could be argued that indie became a community, with fans of indie music coming together at gigs and festivals, connecting over the passion they had for indie music. One iconic community that was created through indie music was the divide between Oasis and Blur fans in the mid-1990s. The battle between these two bands was considered the peak of Britpop years. Both bands received a lot of press during this battle, and whether people decided to side with Oasis or Blur was a very important factor in who people associated themselves within society. The divide wasn't just about the music, but equally about British class and regional divisions, making it a very important part of the 1990s. After the Oasis versus Blur craze, Britpop began to die down and many felt that the era had come to an end. One journalist has said that after Oasis played a two-night set at Nebworth to a combined audience of 250,000, Britpop was bound to come to a decline as nothing after would match its scale. However, this wasn't the end of indie music. Bands such as The Verve, Stereophonics and Coldplay, who had been overlooked during the Britpop hysteria, became more and more popular with indie fans. The 21st century has also seen the birth of many indie bands, who are not on the scale of Oasis or Blur, but are still very popular within the indie culture. Artists such as Two Door Cinema Club, Twin Atlantic, The Kooks and Wolf Alice are all popular bands that have emerged in the noughties and the 2010s. All of these artists have played at iconic festivals such as Tea in the Park and Glastonbury. Recently, indie music has become an even bigger part of society following the previous general election. Indie fans and artists themselves have become very involved in politics, particularly supporting the Labour Party and its leader Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn made an appearance at Glastonbury, which is very popular with indie fans, and also discussed the Oasis versus Blur debate in an interview with indie rock magazine NME. Corbyn's association with indie artists and their fans is beneficial for both indie artists themselves and the Labour Party, who are both getting more press from the two coming together.